Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for nonfiction session in today's fourth annual authors event at Harrison Public Library. I would like to present our speakers, David Gessner. David Gessner is an author, a professor, and one of the leading contemporary voices of the natural world writing. David is an author of Leave It As It Is, A Journey Through Theodore Roosevelt's American Wilderness, which Robert Redford called a rallying cry in the age of climate change. And also he's an author of 11 other books that blend a love of nature and humor. David Gessner currently serves as a chair of the creative writing department at the University of North Carolina, where he is also the founder and editor-in-chief of the literary magazine, Hackathon. Our next author is Sam Kean. Sam Kean is the New York Times bestselling author of 6 books, including The Icepick Surgeon, Murder, Fraud, Sabotage, Piracy, and other dastardly deeds perpetrated in the name of science. His stories have appeared in the New Yorker, New York Times magazines, and Slate, and his work has been featured in NPR's Radio Lab, Science Friday, All Things Considered, and Fresh Air. His podcast, The Disappearing Spoon, debuted at #1 on the iTunes charts for science podcasts. Please welcome our authors, and I let David to talk about his writing.
Thank you very much. I have not talked about this book in a little while, which kind of makes it fun. When you're in the midst of a book tour, you kind of get like a politician where you repeat phrases over and over. And I pretty much had the whole thing memorized. So we'll see if it comes back to me, because it's now a couple books in the rearview mirror. I was describing what I've worked on since this book came out in summer of 2020, or end of the summer of 2020. I, like a lot of us, was kind of reeling from the pandemic, and I got in touch with a small press that I'd always admired. And I said to them, I'd like to write a book through the pandemic, and I'd like to have it published immediately afterwards. So it was this kind of experiment in writing on the heels of the experience. And it was a book about sheltering in place with Thoreau. So it was a book about home and settling and being in place in the coastal area I'm in North Carolina, on Hewlett's Creek, also known as Dawson's Creek down here. And I bring it up because it's kind of the opposite of the books I had done previously. This book, Leave It As It Is a road trip, essentially. As I've progressed in my writing, I like to challenge myself with types of writing. So what I tried to do with this book was have the story of me taking my nephew, who just graduated from college, out west where he'd never been, to the Badlands, to Utah, to California, and hopefully an exciting and beautiful road trip, but also kind of an environmental report on where we are in terms of climate, in terms of drought and fire and storms. And then thirdly, and probably most importantly, a biography of Theodore Roosevelt. The reason I was excited about writing about Theodore Roosevelt is, first of all, I'd had a youthful attraction to him in terms of reading Edmund Morris's book when I was a young man. I was in the midst of a depression in my 20s, and I was really mired in it. I was trying to write fiction, and I wasn't getting anywhere. And I was working as a bookstore clerk and not certain about my future. And I read this biography by Edmund Morris of Roosevelt that energized me. It was like having 6 cups of coffee reading this book. And I'd always loved biography. I had a professor in college, Walter Jackson Bate, who believed that biography was the greatest art because you could put it to use in your life. You could steal things from these subjects. And I certainly did with reading Roosevelt, and it really energized my writing. Speaking of coffee, an aside about Roosevelt was he drank coffee from the second he woke up till he energetically went to sleep, to paraphrase Morris. And like so many things, he created phrases and in the language that we still use today. Maxwell House is good to the last drop, was a Roosevelt quote. Anyway, so I'd been thinking about environmental battles and about Roosevelt. And then when Donald Trump became president, he, as most of you know, unproclaimed or deproclaimed much of Bears Ears, 85%, which was a national monument in Southeast Utah. I had a history with that place. Not only had I done a lot of camping and hiking and writing there, but when the national monument was first proclaimed, I was asked by a group of political people in the West to contribute to an anthology that would be distributed to Congress. I joked that I was the token Easterner because it was mostly Native writers and Western writers, but I had a personal connection to Bears Ears. And when in December, before he ended his term, Obama declared it, there was great euphoria among many of us. Bears Ears, I think people know the basics of it because it's just been in the news again. But one of the most important things about it is it grew out of the thinking, support, study, and political energy of 5 Native American tribes. And it had been, the land there had been studied, beautiful, but not mountain river beautiful, but like high country that dives down into canyons with all sorts of ancient Puebloan ruins. It grew out of this support. And so in a way, I thought it was like taking the best of old school environmentalism and this new vision with this new native vision and creating a confluence of the two. So it was very exciting. And then, of course, once Donald Trump became president, they undeclared it. Now, the interesting thing about that for me was that happened on Roosevelt's birthday, which I think, again, it's 2 books ago, but I think it was October 27th of the first year. And Ryan Zinke, who was the Secretary of Interior for Roosevelt and claimed to be a big Teddy Roosevelt fan, announced this visceration of the monument in front of a portrait of Roosevelt in the White House. So that was the moment the book was born. I was pissed off and I'm going to do something that combines, my love of Roosevelt with my fighting for the environment and my love of travel. So that was what crystallized it. So I went out on a kind of advanced scouting mission in January. I guess it would have been 97. And I felt like I wanted to talk to people who were involved in the creation of Bears Ears. And a very lucky thing happened. Almost all the first people I talked to were Native Americans. And Regina Lopez Whiteskunk in particular was this great source. She had been the Ute representative on the Bears Ears Intertribal Council. And Regina was fantastic. She said, when we went to Washington, we didn't want to relive old crimes and we wanted to create something new. And she talked about being in the president's office and feeling this great sense of empowerment and this new vision of Native power. So that was really exciting. And it also created a problem. And one of the things that makes books interesting, I think, are problems. The problem is that Roosevelt, though progressive to the extreme in some things, was not progressive when it came to Native American or Indian rights at the time, and also had let loose with a few slurs, that's the only thing to call them, during his career as president. He did become more open-minded. He did save lots of land, but there were problems there. So I started to kind of work through those on the page. Now, my process in terms of writing is to throw myself into situations. So the next summer, my nephew was graduating from college, and I picked him up in North Carolina. We drove up the coast, and I kind of wrote as I go. I'm like, when I get going like this, I feel like a reality show onto myself, right? So I drove up. Our first stop was visiting Jamie Raskin, who led the impeachment hearings and was a college classmate. At the time, he was totally out of power but he talked to us about Roosevelt. Then we went to Roosevelt's house. Then we went to Cambridge, where he'd gone to Harvard, and followed his footsteps there. And that was all fun, but it was kind of prelude. The next thing we did was go west. And I brought my nephew, who'd never been west, out camping in the Badlands. And we woke up with buffalo outside the tent. And it was just so thrilling to see him get what the American West means, and open up. And we then headed up to Medora, where Roosevelt had been a rancher. And it was like kind of a Disneyland of Roosevelt. People dressed as Roosevelt, shows about Roosevelt, people talking about him. Roosevelt was kind of the Mickey Mouse of that particular Disneyland. And then we veered down, we went to Yellowstone, and we went to California, where Noah was for the first time. And all the while, I was taking notes, filling journals, thinking about what was going to happen when I got home. And when I got home became the fun process of kind of threading this biography of Roosevelt. Yes. Biden has just restored Bears Ears, and Deb Haaland who's the first Native American Secretary of the Interior. There's just some great poetry in her being the one who has helped restore it. So I was threading these three things and trying to create a book that asks the question about historical empathy. At this time, when canceling is such, the rage, could we go back and find what was good about this man, acknowledge what was bad about him, and put it to use, as I said, a biography in the present? And the way I wanted to put it to use was think about the energy that Roosevelt, who saved millions of acres of land in our country, had brought to conservation, and the way he had made something that before then was a non-issue and still remains somewhat of a side issue, a primary issue. And I thought that this marriage of that energy and excitement with this new vision of, instead of stripping land away from Native Americans helping the drive to save land was something that was really exciting. So that's how I tried to approach writing the book. And then it struck me that I would write third-person interludes where I would use my old fiction writing skills to write about Roosevelt, like Roosevelt on the brink of the Grand Canyon, where he utters the lines, "Leave it as it is," which became the book's title. And I did that throughout the book with Teddy. "Leave it as it is" had kind of a funny afterlife for me in writing the book, in that, as often happens with New York publishers, they came in late in the game and said, "We want to change your title. We want it to have Roosevelt in it, we da-da-da." And I wrote an impassioned letter that ended with "Leave it as it is," regarding the title. So I'm going to cut mine a little short because I'd love to just answer any questions or ideas that you guys have. And there might be some writers out there, and I'd love to talk about how you construct a book like this. I think that when I said that I learned key lessons from Roosevelt when I was younger, one of them was momentum. The importance of momentum in writing, of the creation of energy and the pushing it forward. Roosevelt came at the world with an almost manic energy and momentum, right? He was, or maybe not almost manic, maybe manic. He's the reason Kennedy played football on the lawn, because Roosevelt played with the kids on the lawn. He read a book a night. He said, "Reading is like a disease with me." He threw himself into sports, into intellectual life, into speeches that would go on and on and on, a lot longer than the one that I'm going to give. But he also came back with the Bull Moose Party and put forth a platform that would make Bernie Sanders blush. I mean, it was so progressive that everything in it has come to pass, but it's taken many, many years. Part of it was put forth by his distant cousin, FDR. But so he was a visionary. And I think what he did was give us a way to think about the natural world that we can still use today. The fact that he was so active in the natural world, that he really had kind of almost a nature writer's appreciation of moments, is what makes it so exciting for me. Also, like so many of our great leaders, he was a writer, dozens of books, writing books while he was president even. So this is, for me, he's kind of a thrilling figure. But I'll cut it off and respond to questions and let Sam take over.
Okay, do we have any questions?
Oh, we don't. Oh, I thought we were going to do them at the end.
Yeah,
So.
well,
No, that's fine.
we can leave all the questions to the end, and people can start submitting their questions via chat. And if we do not have any questions right now, I will save mine to the end and let Sam to take the stand and talk about his new book, The Icepick Surgeon.
Okay. Well, first of all, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. And thank you, David. That was fascinating. I'm actually from South Dakota, so it's funny to hear about the Badlands and stuff like that up there. So this book of mine, The Icepick Surgeon, it was a bit of a departure for me in that my books try to be funny and kind of quirky, unusual. Whereas this book had a bit of a dark edge to it. This was a book about scientists who got so obsessed with some topic or idea that they took things way, way too far, to the point that they were trampling ethical boundaries and often committing crimes in the name of science. So in some ways, it really fuses sort of the lurid thrill of a true crime tale with the drama of scientific discovery. And I think the best way to sort of explain and get across the feel of the book is to tell a story from the book. So this story goes back to the very early days of the American Republic. And at the time, this was an era that people really did not donate their bodies to science for a couple of reasons. One is that people considered it sort of shameful to have your body lying there naked while someone was cutting it up and looking over it. People didn't like that. There was also some religious taboos, and people thought that when Judgment Day came, that God would not be able to raise your body from the dead. They didn't want it in pieces. They wanted their bodies to be buried whole. But that taboo against dissecting bodies really introduced a lot of tension into the scientific world, because doctors needed to study bodies in order to heal diseases. They needed to know anatomy. I mean, imagine trying to be a doctor, trying to heal a body and having no idea what its parts were or how they fit together. I mean, that's being like being sort of a car mechanic and never being able to open up the hood and look under the engine. You would have no idea what you're doing. And that was the situation that doctors were in. So there was this tension there. The doctors needed bodies to study, but people did not want to donate their bodies. So the doctors got a little bit, depending on how you want to put it, a little bit creative, or they got a little bit dirty, in that they started robbing graves in order to get bodies to dissect. And in the book, I go into a little bit more detail about, what exactly they did and how exactly it would happen and things like that. But often they let their medical students be the ones who did this. The medical students would often get drunk and they would storm the churchyards at night. They considered it sort of this wild game that they were playing. Other times, doctors would employ professional thieves for them. They were called resurrectionists or sack-em-up men. And these were the ones who dug up the bodies for them. And here is where the trouble started. Because as you can imagine, people were pretty angry when their relatives went missing, when their favorite uncle or grandmother or even child would suddenly be gone from their grave. And resurrectionists came in for a lot of trouble because of this. They were regularly beaten or thrown in jail. One of them got whipped with wires. Sometimes the family would even booby trap the graves with explosives so that they would blow up if anyone tried to open them. They were very angry about this and would go to extreme measures like this. But one case of revenge in New York would become particularly infamous in that it essentially kicked off what became known as the Anatomy Riot. So this riot started with a young medical student one day in the late 1780s, And he was dissecting a woman when he noticed there were a bunch of street kids, peeking in at the window. And you can kind of imagine why these children were excited. I mean, this was a real life dead body. They'd probably never seen anything like this. But you can also imagine why the student was probably a little bit annoyed. He just wanted to work. He wanted to do his studies in peace. And eventually the student got sick and tired of them gawking and making noises and gaping at them. So he pulled sort of a crass joke, in that he picked up the arm of the woman that he was dissecting and he sort of waved it at the boy, sort of a yoo-hoo. And then he said, "This is your mother here. I'm dissecting her." So again, kind of a crass joke just to get the boys to go away. Unfortunately, however, one of those boys had just indeed lost his mother, and he got very upset about this, understandably. So this boy runs home bawling to his father. And his father hears the story, and now the father is upset. So the father grabs a shovel, he marches out, and he starts digging in his late wife's grave. And when he gets to the bottom, he finds that, lo and behold, the grave is empty. Now, we don't know for sure whether that student really was dissecting that boy's mother. It could have been another woman. But in some sense, it really didn't matter. Someone had stolen that woman from the grave. And no matter where she went, the husband's wife was missing. So he gets very angry. He starts marching around to his neighbors, getting them riled up. So they all grab their pitchforks and shovels, and they decide they're going to march on the hospital where the doctors are. And when they arrive there, the doctors absolutely panicked. There was a huge mob of angry people outside. They start jumping out the windows, running as fast as they can. Some of them start hiding up inside the chimneys. The rioters stormed the doors and they overran the place. They started grabbing equipment and smashing it. In a couple cases, they actually dragged bodies outside of the hospital to rebury them in the cemeteries. And they destroyed whatever they could. But that was not enough to slake their anger. By the next day, the mob had grown to 5,000 people. And they decided that trashing one hospital wasn't enough. They were going to go to a different hospital. So they soon marched to the medical school at Columbia University to destroy that. And finally, at the last minute, Alexander Hamilton himself had to stand on the steps of the school and beg the mob to stop, beg them to spare Columbia University. And they did spare Columbia University, but they started marching on to other hospitals and doing the same thing. And by this point, the mayor himself got involved. He was a little panicked. There was a mob running around, destroying medical facilities. And the mayor took many of the doctors in town and he put them in jail for their own protection, because the jail was the stoutest, most impregnable building in town. So the mob decided they were going to march on the jail and surround it. They started screaming, "Bring out your doctors!" And they were smashing the windows there and tearing down the fence. And eventually the mayor felt that he had no choice to call in the militia. But at the last minute, he decided he would maybe try another few politicians to see if they could stop this riot. So they called John Jay in, a future justice of the Supreme Court. And he came on the scene, and again, sort of like Alexander Hamilton, he tried to get the people to stop. But John Jay didn't quite have the same touch with the common people that Alexander Hamilton did. And what did John Jay, this blue blood like John Jay, know about having his loved ones' graves robbed? Nothing. So someone threw a brick at him and beamed him right in the head. They cracked his skull. These people were not messing around. And unfortunately, in the confusion that followed this, the militia ended up opening fire on the crowd of people. At least 7 people died overall, and maybe up to 20 people. This riot started over one dead body, and it ended with many, many more. And I think this story is a fascinating one for several reasons. First of all, it is completely forgotten. I mean, this has grave robbing, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay. It's really a fascinating story, but it's kind of been lost in American history. And I also think it's fascinating because you can really make a case here, I think, for both sides. Because on the one hand, these were just everyday common people. They did not want their loved ones' graves being robbed, completely understandably. And especially because this burden of having their loved ones' graves robbed fell especially heavily on the poorest parts of society. You were much more likely to have your grave robbed if you were Black, if you were Native American, or if you were a poor German or Irish immigrant. They bore the brunt of having their graves robbed. They had every right to be mad. But on the other hand, you had the doctors. And as we've seen with coronavirus, the burden for diseases always falls most heavily on the poor. And the more that these doctors understood about diseases, the more they could help people. They needed to have bodies to dissect. They could not learn anything without having these bodies. So there was always this tension there. And in some ways, it never really went away. I described the riot in New York City, but there were at least 16 other anatomy riots in the United States before the Civil War. There were ones in Cleveland, Philadelphia, Baltimore, St. Louis, New Haven, just over and over and over. These same problems kept springing up throughout the United States. And believe it or not, in some ways, we are still dealing with a lot of these tensions today. Bodies are still being stolen and chopped up in some cases internationally. Activists call it not the black market, but the red market. And again, it's not mostly the poor who suffer this burden. Usually in developing countries where people, again, there's taboos against dissecting their bodies to medical schools or clinics. But it's not always the poor who bear the brunt of this. If you remember Alistair Cook, the Masterpiece Theater host, when he died in the early 2000s, his body actually got stolen and chopped up for parts as well. So this happens throughout the world, even today. And that's one thing I did try to do with this book, is to show how these stories do affect us today and how they affect science. And in a lot of cases, these are historical stories about piracy, fraud, murder, espionage, things like that. But there always is this direct connection to the present, because the sins of science aren't all safely buried in our past. So again, that was just a little bit about the book, kind of an example story. And now I think I'm happy to open it up to questions about the book or writing or whatever else we want to talk about.
Well, thank you so much. Absolutely fascinating. Sam, while we are waiting for people to type their questions or unmute themselves and ask questions, I have a question for you. So you talk about possible future crimes in the appendix. It's not a chapter of the book. Was it a decision that you made at that time, or you just didn't have enough information to make it as a chapter? It's absolutely fascinating what's going on right now, like kidney transplant that we recently saw on the news, Russians filming movies in space. So can you talk a little bit about future of medical crimes?
Yeah, so that was kind of an appendix that I put on the book. Originally, I was thinking it was going to be a chapter, but had a bit of a discussion with my editor, and he just said, it doesn't quite fit in there, but it's good material. Why don't we kind of put it as an appendix at the end? And so I just looked at crimes and how, advanced genetic engineering might introduce new types of crime, how advanced computing and artificial intelligence could produce new crimes, how when we go to space, there might be whole new types of crimes, things like that. So it was kind of a fun thing to look at and to speculate about. I guess another reason to put it in an appendix is that, these things haven't happened yet. So it's a little more speculative, a little less historical than the other chapters in the book. But it was kind of fun to think about these things, and also to, hopefully by talking about them, kind of anticipate them and hopefully be able to prevent some of them in the future.
Took. And David, I have a question for you. In the trip that you took, you had a companion, your nephew, Noah. It was his graduation present. So can you tell us a little bit more about the interaction and how he saw that trip, and did you get along?
Well, we've been close for a long time. He's the son of my sister and her husband got divorced, and I took Noah on many Eastern trips before this. But the funny part, one of the things that I mentioned to Sam in an email talking about how you convert these lives into literature and or something on the page. One thing I do is try to put my character on the page, but Noah's a very different character than I am. He's 6'4", thin, totally shy. When he went to college at the University of North Carolina, Asheville, I told him I'd pay him $100 for every ultimate Frisbee practice he went to, just in the hopes that he'd make some friends and he didn't go to one. So he's very, very shy, very smart, but I don't even know that he said thank you to me after the 3,000 miles to get to California. But what he did do is write a letter later that showed that being in the American West had impacted him. We could drive 2 states without him saying anything. It's really hard for me to go 5 minutes without saying anything. So kind of creating that interaction on the page was part of the fun, and seeing his eyes open on seeing those buffalo or seeing waterfalls or mountains or canyons out west was great. The thing about Roosevelt was he actually described being president as fun, which I don't think anyone else ever has before. His daughter Alice said of him, he wanted to be the corpse at every funeral, the bride at every wedding, and the baby at every christening. And he was just this, sinkhole of attention. And one of the weird things during the book was that during the time I was writing it and after it came out, he was always in the news. Either Trump was quoting him and saying, I'm just as good or the same or just as good as an environmentalist as he is, or getting the word Yosemite wrong and saying Yosemite, or his statue was being pulled down, or John Muir, who he had this famous camping trip out west, was being canceled. So I was like, Teddy would be very happy with this. He's still in the headlines, 100 years after dying. But Noah got really tired of Teddy Roosevelt, and particularly tired of phrases like manly virtue. And I was listening to him on tape as we drove, and Noah has different sensibility, and he'd had enough of Teddy by the end of the trip.
Thank you. I see somebody raise hand, and that person is on the phone. Is it Pat? Would you like to ask a question?
It is Pat. Can you, my question is to Sam. People can donate their bodies to science, give it to a medical school, whatever. Has that completely stopped grave robbing in at least the United States?
Yeah, it has pretty much. There are, and a lot of medical schools do face shortages where they don't have enough bodies, but it has mostly stopped grave robbing for the most part. There have been a couple of cases of essentially crooked funeral directors who have sold bodies kind of under the table when they should not have been, or even people who have replaced individual body parts. There was a story once, they were selling bones for some reason, and they replaced the person's bones with PVC piping in order to try to fool the family members in this. So you do hear stories from individual crooked people, but nothing like the scale that it was going on back then, where pretty much every doctor who wanted to work in anatomy and even coming up through medical school had to work with a stolen body at some point.
Thank you, Sam. Sam, can you talk a little bit about Walter Freeman? That kind of gives the title of your book, his crime, Icepick surgeon.
Yeah, Walter Freeman was the Icepick surgeon of the title. And he's another good example because he really is one of those people where you can kind of see where he was coming from. You can kind of see why he did what he did. He came up in the 1920s and 30s. That's when he started to really get into his practice. And at the time, he was basically wanted to reform mental asylums. So mental asylums at the time were awful places. They couldn't do much for a lot of people. They had zero drugs for them. They had zero effective treatments. There was nothing you could do except throw people in a room and lock the door. That was how they treated them back then. They were awful places. And Walter Freeman despised this. He wanted to go in, he really wanted to help people. And so he didn't invent, but he extended a procedure called the lobotomy. And at the very beginning, lobotomy was defensible as a very last resort measure for the most desperate cases, especially when you had actual neurosurgeons doing the job. But as I explained in the book, Walter Freeman kind of thought of himself as a messiah. He had a bit of a savior, a messiah complex. And he decided that he was going to take this operation, this lobotomy, to the masses. We would no longer have actual neurosurgeons doing it. He wanted to develop an outpatient neurosurgery where he used an ice pick. And this was an ice pick that he had taken out of his kitchen drawer at home. And he would perform operations, brain surgery on people with this ice pick. And he essentially had this vision where he was going to clear out every asylum in the United States and save all these people. Ended up doing it on thousands and thousands of people, the large majority of whom did not need it. Did it on children as young as 4 years old, and even did it on John F. Kennedy's sister, Rosemary Kennedy. She was probably the most famous victim of Walter Freeman and ended her life in an institution because of him. So in the book, I talk about essentially how Walter Freeman broke bad, how he started off doing something that was defensible and ended up one of the most reviled doctors in all of history.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. And he was never convicted of his crime, correct?
No, I mean, what he was doing was technically not illegal. He did get stripped of his operating privileges in different hospitals because people often died on the table, but never actually faced any legal consequences for it.
And David has.
Yeah, I have a question for David too, so you go and I'll ask you that.
So Sam, I had a grad student who was writing a book about falsely accused people in North Carolina and the attempt to free them, basically. And he came in and unlike most grad students, he kind of knew what he wanted to work on during his 3 years.
Okay.
And he asked me questions about kind of segregating the research with the writing and all that. And I gave him very bad advice because of how I write, which one of my favorite quotes is, good writers make outlines, great writers throw them away, you know, and based on what you heard me say about, you know, I'm always writing and researching, and I assume you, given the book, did all the research first and had everything in place, and then is that, and then wrote, and the second part is, you said this is kind of a departure from the earlier books. Was the writing, was the way you went at it also a departure?
So the first question, no, actually, I was doing research and writing in parallel. And the reason I was doing that was because my chapters were a bit independent. So I could basically do all the research for one, be writing it, and then kind of be doing research on the side with the other one. So that's just how I sort of end up, but that's what works best for me is I spend probably half my day or maybe a little more if it's going well, doing the actual writing. And then I'll spend maybe the end of the afternoon doing some more research and stuff like that. So I kind of like being able to work on parallel tracks like that.
That's nice.
Yeah. And what was the second question? It was about.
I wondered if this was a departure, since you said it was a departure stylistically, if it was also a work departure.
With work, no, it wasn't as much of a work departure. It was more that in my other books, I'm having a lot of fun. That's one thing I try to do is show people that you can laugh about science. There are great characters.
It's harder to do that with ice picks.
Yes, exactly. So it did have a darker edge. There are some chapters in the book that are much more lighthearted. There's a story about paleontologists out west, for instance. Marsh and Cope were their names, and they absolutely hated each other. So they would sabotage each other's dig sites, put dynamite in it, and blow each other's stuff up. So no one got hurt in those situations. So there are some sort of zany madcap stories in there as well. But there are people getting hurt in different cases. But I think it's important to sort of look squarely at those cases and talk about them. And so they were fascinating stories, but had a bit of a dark edge sometimes.
I just want to mention that Sam, in his book, he has a chapter works cited, and it's just fascinating as a book to read about the work that he cited in his book.
No. Well, David, you had mentioned
not as exciting.
Yeah.
A little, very exciting.
Yeah, I'm sure it was riveting. It was a lot of fun put together. And so you mentioned that your title with Leave It As It Is, you really fought hard for that title. And I've had it with my books where the title has been changed.
Yeah.
I've been happy with my titles.
So often.
Yeah. Was this one that you felt particularly passionate about, or do you sort of feel passionate about all your titles and want to stick with them?
I mean, I'm kind of an old pro at this point, and I know that half the titles are going to change. I mean,
okay.
What I've done, this was with Simon & Schuster, but the next book is with the small press, Story House Press, the next book that came out. And I'm going to do another book with them because at this point, I like being able to call the shots a little bit more.
Okay.
And I find that hard to do when late in the game, when the publicists come in and say, oh, we want to do it. And it's just like, well, I've been thinking about this hard for 5 years. So I think I'm going to trust myself a little bit.
You kind of get the name in your head, and it's kind of, I have files and emails and stuff of all the old titles, and it's sometimes hard to jump to the new titles after.
Yeah. I mean, I've changed them plenty of times. This one, that's what Roosevelt said, standing on the edge of the Grand Canyon. And the book was really also about the Antiquities Act and national monuments, which are still, even though the Trump undeclaration has been reversed, there's still legal issues with the Antiquities Act that are really fraught. And that would be a bigger loss than Bears Ears, because that's the single tool of a president to save land. So
yeah.
And another fun thing for me was, we have a friend in common, Ben, and he would tell you I've had a love-hate relationship with the phrase nature writer, but it was kind of funny to have the president of the United States basically be a nature writer, and his writing career taking off when he went to Egypt at 14 and got a new pair of glasses so he could see better, and suddenly falling in love with birds and writing about birds. And the guy who wrote 40 plus books, his first writing was all about birds. And to have somebody who's the president have kind of an anthropocentric, a biocentric view of the world instead of anthropocentric is really extraordinary. And you mentioned being from South Dakota. Well, going to North Dakota was the second part of that, is kind of getting out into the, getting out into wilderness. I guess Obama went on that show with Bear Grylls or whatever his name is, but we don't have too many presidents who really can imagine a world, imagine being out in the wilderness. Though I will say Biden did quote Ed Abbey during his Bears Ears ceremony.
Oh, did he? Okay, all right. Didn't he also, I think I read a book about this. He went to the Amazon after his presidency, right?
River of Doubt, yeah.
Yeah, okay, book. Yeah. That's hard to imagine any president doing, just taking off into the Amazon for a couple, like 6 months or whatever he was.
And another thing he did, I mentioned kind of being a reality show onto myself. He would do these adventures and do all this stuff, the energy, like 10 times the energy of a normal person. And then he'd write it up at night. He was always on assignment too, not while he was president, but most of his life. So one thing I do is in terms of, there's the old Churchill line, a change is as good as the rest. And you mentioned doing the research and writing. One thing I like to do is my breaks from writing are traveling. So for instance, going down to New Orleans, and I get to as many places as possible because I know I'm going to be writing it in the first person. And it's basically a placeholder for the research I'm going to do later. Like if I get the physical details of having been there, even if I talk to somebody for half an hour, I can follow up with Zoom, I can follow up with research,
Right.
and thread that in later on. So it's just kind of a replenishing to do the travel, the research, and then the sitting at the desk writing.
Thank you. We have another question from Pam, from Pat.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Yes, this is for David. David, you mentioned how reading the book on Roosevelt as a young man, when, you know, perhaps I'm putting words in your mouth, but when you were depressed or struggling, and such a change it made in your outlook on life. I recently read a book by Doris Kearns Goodwin on leadership. And I know
Great
she
book.
mentioned FDR. Did you read that book? And did she also mention Theodore in it?
She did. And, you know, she mentioned Lincoln, and I'm not going, you know, there've been 10,000 books on Lincoln, so I'm not going anywhere near him as a topic. But I will say, at the beginning, it was mentioned that I just spent 5 years as chair of our department. Now, the beauty is I'm done and my life feels free again and good again. But I will say, though I wasn't leading my country through the Civil War, I was just helping a bunch of old academics. It really was a great book to read, that leadership book, and especially the Lincoln parts with the magnanimous kind of forgiveness were extraordinary. I thought that was a great book, really inspiring.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I guess it kind of goes off of Team of Rivals. Isn't that her earlier book about Lincoln? So yeah.
Yes.
Well, we have time for one more question. Anyone? Okay,
I'm curious, David, what do you not like about the phrase nature writer? Why are you ambivalent about it?
It felt like, you know, kind of effete and like scrimshaw or something, like, you know, like this obscure little thing. Like, I mean, I'm of the belief that Wendell Berry, I now understand, is as great as any American writer, and that the genre is a continuation of like American Romanticism, but by calling it nature writing, it makes it small, I think, you know, and diminished. And I actually say in the new book about Thoreau and the pandemic, I used to not like the phrase. I'm getting to like it because nature writers make connections, and we're in a world right now where it doesn't seem like such a bad thing to be, given what's happening in terms of everything, in terms of climate and where we are. So I'm making peace with it, but it's taken about 30 years.
Okay. You're mellowing.
Yeah. So you can call me a nature writer.
I have to ask you about the covers of the book. They're just jumping out of the shelf, so well done. Did you have something to do with it? Did you have something to say when the artwork was presented to you?
Yeah, I think sort of like with the titles, you often have veto power over it, but I do not have any sort of visual sense like that. So I kind of leave that up to other people. And if I hate it, I say something, but it hasn't happened so far, thankfully, where we've had any struggles with it.
And mine, this is an earlier book called All the Wild That Remains. It's about Wallace Stegner and Edward Abbey and a trip through the West. And it's probably the book of mine that's done most well. So basically, this was with Norton. So Simon & Schuster basically ripped it off, did you know, in a good way. So we have Utah and Canyonlands, and then we have Teddy sitting there, looking a little frumpy, but he's in Yosemite. That's the same trip he took with John Muir while president, where he was supposed to go to a fundraising cocktail party, but bailed out on the party and went camping for 3 days in a snowstorm. So that also wouldn't happen with our current or recent presidents.
Well, thank you so much. It was absolutely a fascinating session. We enjoyed to hear about your books and about your writing process. It was fantastic.